So welcome back. I'm here with Pierre Mitchell, who is the Chief Research Officer for Spend Matters. I'm Michael Jansen, the Chief Research Officer for the Everest Group, and we're joined by Arco and Andrew, who are resident subject matter experts here. And we're going to take you through a follow-on discussion that really drives down into the practices that make enterprises great in terms of getting the best possible impact. And so let's just start with what we've done in the research. And so we've got what you'll see is our famous dot plot chart for our Pinnacle studies. And Pinnacle studies are really geared toward evaluation of enterprise to enterprise. So they're not meant to talk about vendors or service providers or any of the technology in the marketplace. They're really meant to really understand the capabilities and the impact that organizations are getting from implementing the practices around contingent workforce. So we're going to take you through that. And if you look at the dot plot chart on there, each one of those dots represents one of the study participants. And so each of those folks have filled out a fairly lengthy survey and also done qualitative interviews with us where we compared capability across the bottom and then looked at outcomes across the y-axis along the left. And we plotted those out there and scored them. And what you see, if you go back to your basic statistics classes in college, you'll see a pretty good regression that goes from the bottom left to the upper right. And what we're really proud of is you don't see a lot of dots in the upper left. So people that have real basic capabilities don't get fantastic outcomes. And those in the bottom right, which you don't see anybody down there, those that have implemented capabilities, they do get better outcomes. And that's thus puts them in the upper right. And so that good cause and effect relationship between capabilities and outcomes is what we're striving for. And what we're going to show you in this the rest of this session is really what those Pinnacle enterprises, those organizations in the upper right, how do they compare to others? And so if we bring you into the first data conversation here, it really gets into the conversations I've had with Pierre before, and Andrew and Arco is, who really owns the contingent workforce? And that's kind of one of the interesting dilemmas in this segment here. Is it procurement or is it an HR owned opportunity? And what we have determined is, depending on who you ask, and you always got to look for sample bias, it's roughly 50-50. Some folks will say it's 40% procurement, 60% HR. Others will go 60% the other way, 60-40 the other way. But in our case here, what we found was pretty good representation in our sample was 50-50. So the involvement of HR in the contingent workforce was 50-50. We'll see a slight smidgen of involvement of HR with the Pinnacle enterprises. But where we see the real difference is down in that next category of how's the alignment with permanent strategies. And you'll see there a much stronger alignment with the Pinnacle enterprises. And we think that's really important, is that ultimately this is about the talent and it is about the HR strategy. So we think it's really important that we're able to show you what those enterprises in the green have done differently. They get the alignment, but what have they done differently?
Yeah, Mike, that's a great point. Just quick chime in on that one. So for procurement organizations, it's really the big best practice is around like early involvement, demand management, stakeholder management, and obviously on the talent equation, the more in which you can kind of plug into the workforce planning, talent management up front, which means with HR, with the business, that's going to really lead to, being at the table to then bring kind of all the levers into play. So that it really kind of confirms what we've seen on our side as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we wanted to do is just take you through a couple of the findings, and we obviously don't have time to go through the entire study, but we just wanted to pick a few of those. And the first one really here is where people might consider this a mature space, there is a wide difference between the effectiveness and the impact among those enterprises. So Arco, what were some of your study findings that you thought were most important?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about the difference in benefits, and if you start with something like operational metrics, there's still quite a lot of variance. And first of all, probably I'll talk about value-oriented elements. Within that, something like a quality of hire or new hire attrition. These are things which were traditionally not associated with the contingent workforce, but are being increasingly associated now. And within these elements, we see a pretty big difference between the Pinnacle enterprises and others. More interestingly, even for some of the more tactical elements like classification errors, there's still a big difference between Pinnacle and others. Essentially, a lot of gap or a lot of areas for others to improve. And then, if you move to some of the strategic impact, there's again a lot of difference. Michael, any comments here?
Yeah, so we're looking at the how the programs have an impact on the strategic objectives of talent, and that ability to get that future-ready workforce is extremely important here, and it's one we focused in on. But again, we're back to the alignment conversation, that competitive advantage, the ability to complement the permanent labor force. All of those things, all of those aspects at a strategic level see a significant difference here. So we look at those as being real differentiators for those Pinnacle enterprises. So if we move into the best practices, and again, we're doing a very abbreviated session here, but what are those best practices that you've seen that elevate the effectiveness of the contingent workforce, Arco?
Yeah, there's a number of them, and we can probably broadly categorize them into 4 groups. Within talent sourcing, workforce management, spend management, and other best practices. And some of those around talent sourcing or workforce management have a lot of things which have been imported from the permanent side. So something like having a common employer brand for permanent and contingent workforce, or have some sort of common talent communities. Direct sourcing, a lot of relation with the permanent side. Similarly, workforce planning or demand management, or measuring the performance of individual workers. And then the best practices around spend management are essentially procurement best practices, which are used for all categories of direct and indirect. Now also being used for the contingent workforce side. And lastly, things like supplier management and empowerment. Rather than treating them as people who are just providing you with labor, and treating them with more respect can yield a lot of good benefits. And then the last thing is, these are all sort of services or processes, but technology plays a pretty important role over here. Andrew, any views over there?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the focus of new technology at this point in time is very much skewed toward the talent sourcing category, where we're seeing a whole influx of new technology solution providers that are addressing direct sourcing, talent community management, and even employer branding. So that is definitely an area that is very hot in terms of the technology, and I think that's an area to focus on.
Yeah, and then when we did our research, probably the top 5 or 6 areas where we found Pinnacle enterprises significantly ahead of others were things like strategic workforce planning, or applying the tail end or rope spend management strategies to contingent labor as well. So interesting results, and with that, we should probably get into the next important finding from our research. Michael?
Yeah, and Arco, just to amplify what you were saying there is, when you and I were doing a lot of the interviews for this, we heard a real difference of implementation of some of these practices, and some of them were, you go back to how they treat the classification of workers. Some of them were treating, hey, we treat them just like employees, and then others were treating them, hey, they're not employees, and we treat them very differently. And there were lots of different reasons for that. But ultimately, I think in the future, we got to look at these things. It says they are going to be your resource pool. And, no matter how their pay structure or how you source them, that's going to be needs to become less visible and less important down the road. So let's move into the services procurement and how that's coming together.
Yeah, so services procurement is an interesting area because a lot of enterprises are increasingly focusing over here. One key reason or big reason is the traditional temp labor management has sort of plateaued in terms of benefits. So people are naturally looking for areas where they can get additional benefits, and statement of work management and services procurement is one such area. And we see that most enterprises, whether Pinnacle enterprises or other enterprises, are now including that as part of their contingent workforce management program. The key difference lies in where or how much of the spend is actually part of the program. So we see the Pinnacle enterprises sort of ahead over there. And that is why they're also getting significantly better, spend savings through the services procurement angle or statement of work angle. And again, previous to similar areas, there are quite a few best practices over here. So things like, category management, which is integral to broader procurement, is now being increasingly used over here for categories such as IT services, professional services, facilities. And, addition to that, something like headcount tracking or the spend analysis and supplier scorecards are also pretty natural things to do over here, similar to other procurement areas.
Yeah, I almost have to laugh at the headcount tracking is, you see that in the Pinnacle enterprises, that's kind of pretty much an assumption that's going to be well integrated, whereas it's all over the board on the non-Pinnacle. And I know, Pierre, you were looking at the slide with some thoughts on this one as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting organizational issue, and the fact that from the contingent workforce side, when you start to focus beyond staff aug and start getting into SOW based spend, SOW is basically just a contract. And so when you start talking about managing service providers and managing SOWs, you're really talking about managing suppliers from a strategic supplier management, category management, obviously sourcing and into the transactional side. But it's really kind of creating a kind of a convergence where you need to get your IT VMOs, your kind of third-party management, and any groups that you have around managing kind of strategic services providers like BPOs and MSPs, getting those centers of excellence aligned with procurement that is trying to do strategic category management of lots of the spend is services categories around corporate services, and that's becoming like a massive spend category that's expanding. And so there has to be that alignment between supplier vendor management, category management, spend management, and the talent management side. And it's really kind of forcing an alignment in a good way. It's really, it's forcing a decision where those who can step up and get the groups aligned are really getting a lot of this value, like your study has shown. And those who kind of can't get the stovepipes aligned to kind of manage this integrated services world and more the digital piece, they're going to struggle. So it's a big organizational issue as much as kind of just individual, practices and tools and whatnot. So.
Yeah, and I think as we all would agree that this, as talent becomes more scarce and the different ways we contract become more complex, getting this right is not just going to be an optional exercise. It can't be something you do as an afterthought. And so, all right, with that, let's wrap on this section. Obviously, we're just showing you a few pages out of the research and a few tidbits. If you're interested in the full results, certainly reach out to us and we can happy to walk through those with you. I think the full deck is by itself is 75 to 100 pages. So we can take you through any portion of that may be of assistance to you. And Pierre and Andrew and Arco, we're going to stop here on this one and we'll start again really talking about the future of digital happenings on the provider ecosystem. So talk to you soon.